Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
Manchester City have progressed through to the semi-finals of the Champions League, but once again, Tuchel's side can count themselves unlucky as they frankly dominated this match with more possession, shots in the box, and expected goals. As always, it was an absolutely fascinating encounter when Pep and Tuchel clashed. But let's take a closer look at how Tuchel's tactics expose some of the weaknesses of Pep's 3-2-4-1 shape, and we'll begin with Bayern on the ball. And right from the off, there were various ways that Bayern could take advantage of City's shape, and most of the progression came down the flanks, with the right hand side in particular being targeted. We could at times see Bayern Munich build in more of a 3, with Pavard remaining deeper, whilst Cancelo on the other side would have more room to progress. Whilst at times we could see them use this double pivot of Goretzka and Kimmich, but for the most part, one or the other would remain deeper, allowing the other to push higher up the pitch to be closer to Choupo-Moting. So, as we know in these situations, City like to start in more of a 4-4-2 in their defensive stance that looks something like this. However, due to the 3-man backline, when City were being more aggressive in the press, it would mean Grealish would have to come from out to in to look to close down Pavard, allowing them to have more of a 3 versus 3 against the backline. However, this could lead to some obvious problems, as there was potentially a 1v1 with Coman against Ake, and Coman could initially drop into this space to receive the ball, because Ake could be reluctant to push this high up, leaving that much space in behind him, knowing that Coman had the beating of him on the outside. So we have the usual front two of Haaland and De Bruyne, but Grealish is higher up with one eye on Pavard, who in this case is operating deeper. Bayern Munich quickly realized they had an opportunity, so instead of keeping Pavard deep, he operated more as a traditional right back, even if City were in this 4-4-2. And as we saw in the first leg, even in situations where there was a 2 versus 2, Grealish could still look to press the outside centre-back, namely Upamecano, because he was the man tasked with advancing up the pitch with the ball. The reason for Grealish advancing is that it could allow one of De Bruyne and Haaland to operate slightly deeper, making progression through the centre much more difficult. But today, all it did was leave Manchester City looking extremely vulnerable. And on any occasion they were able to get past Grealish pressing, there was immediate danger for Manchester City, due to this potential 2 versus 1 in this scenario. So what we could see is a ball into a midfielder who would then bounce it out to Pavard. So if Ake looked to confront him, there would be an easy pass into Coman in behind. But even if Ake chose to remain deeper, when Pavard advanced, the 1v1 pace of Ake versus Coman meant that he could still play a ball down the outside for the Frenchman to get on the end of, and Bayern would then often look to overload the box, trying to get crosses in. So here we see that De Bruyne and Haaland are high up, and initially it looks like Grealish is deep covering Pavard. And this means Upamecano has a bit of space, so when he receives, he starts to drive up. And now Grealish is drawn to the man, which frees up that direct pass into Coman, and we can see Pavard is also behind the Grealish press. So Coman bounces the ball back into Pavard, and then attacks the space behind Ake, who he had dragged high. And this leads to a dangerous crossing opportunity. Here, when there's no pressure, we once again see Upamecano being tasked with driving up the pitch. This draws Grealish in, and Pavard as well as Coman are high up. So Pavard can receive freely high up in that region, allowing Coman to be more tucked in. And now Bayern have space between the lines that they can look to attack. So much like we saw in the first leg, Tuchel's tactics forced Pep to change his pressing shape, meaning that he now stuck more to the 4-4-2 to avoid Pavard being found, as this would leave Gundogan with too much room to cover. This meant that Grealish was now deeper during this phase. Although if Pavard dropped deep, he could still follow, as they were more happy to have a 1v1 up top rather than a 2 versus 1. So now what we saw instead was a pressing 5 of Haaland, De Bruyne, the midfield double pivot, and Bernardo, who would come in off the flanks often onto a centre back or tucking into the midfield. And it would be up to Stones to decide whether he would push high to cover Musiala with the defence shifting to a 3, or staying deeper and risking the man between the lines. Here we see that front pressing 5 with Grealish much deeper on the pitch. Once again, the pressing 5 with the double pivot of Rodri and Gundogan high, And in this case, Stones has opted to push high up to cover Musiala. And in this front two, City would have two options, as they could push up onto the centre backs with the pivots looking to cover, or stay deeper, and either way, City still found themselves with numerous problems in the midfield. This was primarily because, even if this was the case, with Rodri and Gundogan remaining deeper, Bayern Munich was still able to overload this region, and this is because by pushing the fullbacks high, at least one of the wingers would be able to drop into a more central region, and this would then be backed up by Choupo-Moting, who could drop in, so now there was a 3 versus 2, potentially allowing a line-breaking pass. And even if Choupo-Moting had remained deeper, as we discussed, Bayern tended to build with a single pivot, meaning that it could be the other pivot who would be pushing high up to cause that overload in a central region, allowing Bayern Munich to still maximize their width. Here we see one such situation with the front two and Rodri and Gundogan being drawn higher. So Pavard is providing the width, meaning that Coman can now tuck in to receive. And at the same time, we see that double pivot, but Choupo-Moting has dropped deeper, as well as Kimmich and Musiala being in the midfield, with Goretzka deeper, meaning they still have a 3 versus 2 in this midfield region, as well as the option of finding the man between the lines. Which is exactly what happens, and Bayern are now running at the back line. Of course, this was even worse when the front two were pressing high and being backed up by the double pivot, as this would leave a massive gaping hole in the midfield, especially due to the pace of the wingers who are having a lot of joy in behind, preventing City from compacting the space. That would mean Musiala, often joined by a winger, would find space between the lines once again. The City double pivot is high once again, and Pavard is providing the width on the right hand side. This has allowed Coman to tuck in, we see Choupo-Moting dropping, as well as Musiala, who are all available between the lines to potentially receive. So we repeatedly saw Bayern breaking the lines and running at the City defense almost at will. However, where City had two killers in the final third, in De Bruyne with his excellent passing, as well as Haaland with his excellent finishing, Bayern didn't quite have that extra bit of quality, meaning that they suffered. But even when City were in possession, their shape left them vulnerable defensively. So it's important to note that rather than being a right back who inverted, Stones was a centre back who pushed up into the midfield, to be alongside Rodri, forming the double pivot and the midfield box, whilst Akanji would tuck in alongside Diaz and Ake. Of course, the shape had advantages for City, as it would mean that they potentially had the overload in the midfield in this 4 versus 3 shape, and this would mean that Bayern Munich had to defend with much narrower wingers, creating space out on the flanks. And with the wingers pushing high up the pitch, we saw that this was often an opportunity for the likes of De Bruyne to receive out wide and create a 2 versus 1 against Cancelo. Here's an example of just that, with De Bruyne moving wide because Sane, who was narrow, is now drawn to Akanji. But in recent videos on the channel, we've covered why this shape is so advantageous for City, but let's dig into some of the deficiencies of it, primarily in the transitional phase, where we often saw Akanji and Ake being wider, with Stones having pushed into the midfield. What this meant is that whenever there was a turnover, Stones had a decision, whether he would stay high up to help the counter-press and pick up someone like Sane or Musiala, or look to immediately drop deep, potentially leaving a lot of room in the midfield for Bayern Munich to then advance. And this was only a choice because at times Akanji in the transition would not have the time to tuck in. And this would mean that there was a massive gap between Akanji and Diaz, and Bayern Munich's front players, who are rather pacey, consistently looked to take advantage of this space created by Stones being high in the build-up phase. So Stones is a pivot, and when City lose the ball, does he stay high on Musiala or look to drop in? So in this case, with Sane occupying Akanji, there is a potential gap, as Stones is kind of halfway in between the two. A different scenario but a similar problem, and this time Stones is on Musiala. So you can see this massive gap between Akanji and Ruben Diaz. But again, it's not taken advantage of. But here it is, as Haaland drops the ball into Stones, but there is a turnover. Now Stones is still out of position, and Akanji hasn't tucked in on time, meaning that Sane has that room between Diaz and Akanji to attack. Sane was found, but opts to cut back. Overall, the aggregate scoreline might say 4-1, but both ties were much closer than that, and have shown that although City are very good, they are not perfect. But City won't care too much, having gone through to the semi-finals. For the manager tactical scores, Tuchel did all he did, identifying the weaknesses and taking necessary risks, meaning he earns an 8. While Pep wasn't bad per se in this leg, but still only earns a 6. The semi-finals are set, and I want your early predictions for them down in the comments below.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.